Hello, and welcome back to Off the Deaton Path. I'm Stan Deaton with the Georgia Historical Society, and we welcome you to this podcast for the week of October 24th, 2024. We are recording this week from the Political Unrest Department here at the Georgia Historical Society on the 15th floor of the Jepson House overlooking beautiful Forsyth Park in downtown Savannah. My very special guest this week is historian and Pulitzer Prize winner Steven Hahn. Steven Hahn is a professor of history at New York University. He earned a PhD in history from Yale University under the direction of C. Vann Woodward, a master's in philosophy and a master's in history from Yale, and a bachelor's in history from the University of Rochester, where he studied under Eugene Genovese. Steve is a specialist on the international history of slavery, emancipation, and race, on the construction of American empire, and on the social and political history of the long 19th century in the United States. He has written for a host of national publications, including The Nation, Dissent, The New Republic, and The New York Times. He's been actively involved in projects making history and liberal arts education available to a wider public, and is currently teaching in NYU's prison education program. Steve Hahn is the author of several path-breaking and award-winning books, including The Roots of Southern Populism, Yeoman Farmers and the Transformation of the Georgia Upcountry, published by Oxford University Press in 1983. That book won the Allan Nevins Prize and the Frederick Jackson Turner Award. A Nation Under Our Feet, Black Political Struggles in the Rural South from Slavery to the Great Migration, published by Harvard University Press in 2003. Winner of the Pulitzer Prize, the Bancroft Prize, and the Merle Curdy Prize. The Political Worlds of Slavery and Freedom, published by Harvard University Press in 2009. A Nation Without Borders, the United States and its World in an Age of Civil Wars, 1830 to 1910, published by Penguin in 2017. And his latest book, and the one he is here to talk about with me today, entitled Illiberal America, A History, published by W. W. Norton on March 19th of this year. It was reviewed in the New York Times on March 17th and the Washington Post on March 21st. Steve's new book came to my attention when I read this blurb for his book, and I want to quote it to you at some length. And I quote here, "If your reaction to the January 6, 2021 insurrection at the Capitol was to think, quote, that's not us, think again. In Illiberal America, a Pulitzer Prize-winning historian uncovers a powerful illiberalism as deep-seated in the American past as the founding ideals. The attack on American democracy and images of mob violence led many to recoil, thinking, that's not us. But now we must think again, for Steven Hahn shows in his startling new history that illiberalism has deep roots in our past. To those who believe that the ideals announced in the Declaration of Independence set us apart as a nation, Hahn shows that Americans have long been animated by competing values, especially or equally deep-seated, in which the illiberal will of the community overrides individual rights and often protects itself by excluding perceived threats, whether on grounds of race, religion, gender, economic status, or ideology." Unquote. Needless to say, that got my attention, and I thought this is a book that I need to read and think about and talk to the author about, particularly when that author is a historian of the standing of Steven Hahn. And I did. My conversation with Steven Hahn begins now. Steven Hahn, welcome to our podcast.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.
This book you have written, called Illiberal America, A History, is quite a startling piece of scholarship. It has been reviewed nationally. I want to start out, before we get to any of the particular things that the reviewers have said about your book, tell our listeners, first of all, who may not be historians, as you and I are, first of all, let's start with, what is a liberal America? People tend to hear that word now and they think of contemporary politics because it's thrown around as an insult.
Right.
So what is, first of all, liberal America? What is it we think of?
Well, first of all, I think the idea of liberal America seems to be a major through line over the course of U.S. history, which is intended to encompass a number of ideas. Now, as you pointed out, Liberal itself is a historical concept that has meant different things at different times, but mostly as opposed to a kind of partisan identification. Liberal is meant to evoke a certain set of political dispositions. It has to do with an emphasis on individual rights. It has to do with an emphasis on free speech. It has to do with an emphasis on representative institutions and democratic practices as a means of determining who holds political power. It has to do with accepting outcomes in elections, not using coercive means, either to influence voting or to shape the holding of power. And, there is this idea that the United States, American history, insofar as there's a dominant theme, is one that has to do with an enduring liberal tradition. One of the things I try to do in the book, right from the beginning, is to suggest that this very idea of the American liberal tradition is itself an invention of the period around the Cold War. Up until that point, historians never talked about the theme in U.S. history as being a liberal tradition or political liberalism. It had to do mostly either with the influence of Britain or continental Europe, the Anglo or Teutonic germ theory. And then, of course, with people like Frederick Jackson Turner, who pushed back against it, it had to do with developments within the North American continent in the United States, the frontier as a source of democracy. So democracy was certainly part of this discussion, but so was conflict. Charles Beard, a kind of progressive tradition of interpretation. And it's not really until the, late 1940s and 1950s with people like Louis Hartz and Richard Hofstadter, Daniel Bell, and a number of others who were reflecting on what had happened in the 30s and 40s around the defeat of fascism, but also the challenges of socialism and communism, and who were attempting to define a sense of American distinctiveness. And so the liberal tradition really took off. Interestingly enough, it came under attack pretty quickly, but it has endured. And I think part of our current political moment, at least among those, well, in some ways, among those who both um, are opposed to Donald Trump and the MAGA movement, but even though some of those who sort of align with it, see the liberal tradition either as being scoffed at or as, being something that needs to be replaced.
So the idea of liberal America really is this narrative that we have that America from the beginning has been a land of opportunity and freedom,
Hmm.
that has just simply expanded, right? The things that have happened in our history, whether it be the end of slavery or civil war or in all the different revolutions and movements of the 20th century are all designed to expand the right to vote, the right to be included in society, that America's trajectory is one toward ever expanding freedom. And your
Right.
your book turns that upside down.
Well, yeah, I mean, certainly the idea is the liberal tradition idea is a kind of linear
Mm-hmm.
sense of U.S. history and one that leaves Europe behind pretty
Mm-hmm.
well.
Mm-hmm.
And, I challenge this on a number of fronts. I got interested in doing this. In some respects, I've been writing about this my whole career, but mostly from the perspective of those who have been on the receiving end of various forms of illiberalism. But
Mm-hmm.
I got interested in this during the uh, election campaign of 2016, uh, mostly because of observers who constantly harped on this idea of Donald Trump violating liberal democratic norms. And I thought this was really remarkable given the moment, since so many of those norms were being violated all the time, well before Donald Trump even decided to run. I mean, if you think about what the Supreme Court was doing since 2000, if you think about the 1990s and the lurch of the Republican Party really toward a kind of white nationalism led by Patrick Buchanan, if you think even earlier about the rise of David Duke in Louisiana and his ability, even as a Nazi and Klansman, to win almost 60% of the white vote. The challenges to the Voting Rights Act, the states who were enacting all sorts of legislation meant to make voting and holding office and wielding political power more difficult. It was clear American democracy was having a lot of troubles, and it was, I think the presidential election of 1996, which was shortly after Bill Clinton signed a really punitive um, crime bill, which accelerated mass incarceration. It was the lowest turnout since the 1920s in national elections. So there was a lot of ways, and so I was interested in why it was that, it's really smart observers who were not necessarily partisan, but who were troubled by what they saw, somehow thought that we were kind of swimming along pretty well, and all of a sudden the waters were being disturbed by this candidate who didn't seem to be to respect the constitutional guardrails or the traditions of participating in public political life.
And especially on the heels of the election and re-election of Barack Obama. This seemed
That's right.
especially, I think, startling to a lot of people.
It was. And, one of the things that, anybody who really looked at it recognizes that, while on the one hand, it was a remarkable moment. And I think that even a lot of people who did not support him kind of prided themselves on what appeared to be an ability to transcend racial boundaries that had been in place for so long. And it was possible to talk about a post-racial society. But that didn't last very long. And within a couple of months, you had the Tea Party movement. And it was very clear that on the one hand, it was possible for a person of African descent actually to achieve that kind of public support. And on the other hand, it was very clear that among substantial sections of the population, Barack Obama embodied everything everything they feared, all the directions of the country, as white people were going to be moving into a demographic minority status. So I think, Donald Trump was able to tap into that. And whatever else you think of him, he certainly has a kind of genius for understanding the fears that people feel and to work with them, to his benefit. And, that's certainly something that he did very successfully. And whatever the outcome in this election has, managed to continue to do.
Hmm. And to be clear to people listening to this, it may sound as if your book is really about contemporary America,
No,
and it
it's
is only.
not.
This is a deep work of scholarship, and it's about
Right.
history, and it's about the moment. So I want to set it up in two ways. First, I read, like a lot of people who read your book or found it on that site we all go to look for books, that it said, January 6th. Right, we all watched that, and I think the initial reaction among most people was, "That's not who we are."
Hmm.
That's what got me interested in your book, because it's set up as, well, is that really true? Maybe it is closer to who we are. We've just chosen not to see that. And so I want to talk about that. But also, you mentioned the fact that you think, in some sense, Trump represents the idea of people who see America changing demographically and otherwise in a way that they don't like.
Hmm.
There have been moments like that before in American history, as you
Hmm.
write about in this book. So first off, I want you to knock down the idea that for a lot of people, this is just about this moment, right? That demographically, America is becoming more non-white. And so it explains an aberration, and I put quotes around that, like somebody like Donald Trump, like George Wallace, that these people periodically
Mm,
flare up as demography changes and America becomes less something than it was.
right.
These are aberrations. Your whole point in this book is this is not an aberration.
Right, that is my point. And it's not to suggest that this sort of thing is happening all the time, but it is to suggest that the ideas and the practices and the aspirations that what I call illiberalism represents have long been very close to the surface, have tapped into the way in which a lot of Americans imagined the kind of world that they wanted to either create or protect, and that it's not a continuity story, which it's all the same thing, but it is to say, as you pointed out, that certainly at moments of change and disruptions, that it's very easy for illiberal behavior, illiberal ideas, illiberal practices to come to the surface and show themselves in very powerful ways and very influential ways because of their own access to power at different points. If we look back over the course of U.S. history, the truth of the matter is, well, whatever we want to talk about the liberal tradition, American governance has mostly been in a conservative direction, and the so-called liberal, or rather modern liberal moments, are relatively few and mostly relatively short. So I think that's important. I think conservatism is closely entangled with illiberalism. It's not necessarily the same thing, but I guess I was struck when I started, researching and started writing about this book that it was actually more significant than I thought. That it was like every rock you picked up, there it was. And even what I try to do with the book is not to identify moments that have customarily been recognized as sort of very problematic or indicative of American violence or racism, but actually pick out moments in the past that we've associated more clearly with what you might call a liberal disposition, and then to try to interrogate them and see the way. And I mean, it's a book not only about illiberalism, but about the ways in which illiberalism tangles up liberalism and other political currents that have been important in the American past. So it seems to me that that makes for a more powerful and to some extent more depressing story, because, it's the good guys too who end up doing the stuff that makes it possible for others with different kind of objectives to have enormous influence.
One of the things that I've heard, and I know you have too, is really since 2016, is the idea that, people are not surprised, even historians I've heard say this, we're not surprised that a political figure like Donald Trump could arise uh, in our culture, um, but that he would find such a wide audience, that
Mhm.
his ideas, that his rhetoric, that his whole outlook on life, whatever that is, very dark, would find such a welcome and receptive audience. And one of the things your book makes clear is that audience has always been there. I think it's been disturbing for people in modern America to go, I didn't know this about my neighbors. But one of the things your book makes clear
Right.
is those people have always been there.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think it is important. I mean, part of what I was interested in doing this book was what you might call decentering liberalism. In other words, instead of beginning with the assumption that a liberal tradition has been at the center of American political culture, which I think has made it difficult for us to recognize and appreciate different political currents, whether they're of illiberal nature, or whether they're populist or social democratic or feminist. And to that extent, everything that doesn't fall within the liberal tradition seems to be some sort of backlash. There's not a lot of substance to it. People being angry, people being rageful, whether they're being rageful at the concentration of political and economic power, or whether they're being rageful at certain social or ethnic groups or elites, however they want to define it. I think that that has been a really pretentious perspective that I don't think aligns very well with, in fact, the complexity. I mean, I'm more struck by the complexity of American politics and political culture and by the volatility of it, because it's not that your neighbors, you're surprised that they're capable of something. It's that they can move across the political spectrum in ways that can be very unpredictable. And so that the kind of things that erupt at certain moments that, might be shocking, it can come from people who, at other moments, because of the sort of confluence of social and political developments, could move in other directions. So I don't think that American politics, and even thinking about a deep history of liberalism, means that things are set in stone. It's always been that way. It's always there. But there are things that are there that I think we have not adequately recognized over time. And that have, it's a lot easier to appeal to people's fears. It's a lot easier for people to have narrow views about senses of belonging or senses of rights or concerns about who your enemies are. I mean, Tocqueville saw this. On the one hand, he celebrated the American communities as sort of a fount of democracy. And, at the same time, he was terrified by the kind of power that these communities could wield. And I think one of the continuities in across American history is this idea of the will of the community, even over the rule of law. Community, of course, is constantly being redefined. And, we think of sometimes community as something small, something very closely interconnected. And at times it is, but at other times it becomes a rhetorical device to try to offer people a sense of identification and belonging, whether even if they're not directly connected with anybody else. And this is remains, as you know, a very powerful language and a way of drawing, the lines in the sand, is that, this, we will not tolerate this. Parents have rights. This community have rights. There's this idea that whatever rights you may have rights, but you have rights over there. You don't have rights over here. And, I think that kind of particularist notion of rights is a deeply part of the American historical experience, even when we're looking at moments that we tend to um, associate with, democratic practices or small R Republican practices, or even ideas that have to do with rights and equality. I think equality has always been a very difficult issue in American political culture. And I think one of the things that it's easy to tap into are basic ideas that equality is not the basis of our social order. Inequality really is. And inequalities of different sort, of gender, of race, of nationality, of faith, and, a desire for a certain kind of, cultural homogeneity or cultural conformity, um, which are easy to see as ways of defending communities of belonging against what are regarded as threats. I mean, it's easy to try to protect what you do know than struggle for what you might aspire to, but you don't really know.
Okay,
And to
so
work with people you're not used to working with,
right, and accepting them as equals, as you say.
and accepting them as potential partners. Yes.
Hmm. So we've been banding around things like, okay, there's been these particular moments in the past that are very much like things we're going through now. And so for the benefit of our listeners, I want to dig down now and talk about
Yeah,
some of those
sure.
periods. And I want to
Okay.
first juxtapose what the traditional narrative is versus
Yeah.
what you've done. And we're going to start, you go all the way back to the beginning, the 17th
Yeah.
century, but I want to start in the 1830s. In the
Okay.
traditional narrative, that is a period when abolitionism is on the rise.
Hmm.
People are moving westward. Of course, they're displacing Native Americans, but this is where the first, so we're told, the first germs of the idea of freedom and equality is
Hmm.
planted by the abolitionist. And though this is not widely popular in the beginning, suddenly, by the 1860s, it becomes widespread. Everybody believes in this, so to speak.
Hmm.
And your answer to that is hogwash. You lay out a very dark portrait of what the 1830s were really like. Tell us about it.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's one of the things I wanted to do. I thought that would be a particularly good moment to try to suggest both the limits and contradictions of, sort of the liberal tradition view of the Jacksonian period, which is generally, even among those, as you point out, who
Yeah, I forgot about the
recognize,
Jacksonian Democrats, right?
Jackson, there was a slaveholder, yes, of course, there were problems with Native people. But generally speaking, it's known as a Jacksonian democracy because of the extension of the franchise, the lowering of barriers to office holding,
Mm-hmm.
the beginning of mass politics in
Mm-hmm.
the United States, all of which is true. I mean, this wasn't being made up. But what I try to draw attention to is not simply the limitations of who is part of the Jacksonian political nation, so to speak, but also how much this was accompanied by expulsions. Um, the expulsions of Native people are the best known and most dramatic, but there are expulsive mob violence against Catholics, against Black people, against, as you say, abolitionists. I mean, anti-abolitionist riots are across the Midwest and Mid-Atlantic and Northeast,
Mormons.
the Mormons, which is, an amazing story about. I mean, this was not, we don't like you people. This is, I mean, this was lethal. And, they end, I mean, Joseph Smith is murdered, and the Mormons are run out of Ohio and then Missouri, and then eventually Illinois. I mean, I think it was sort of an example of how the expansion of American democracy kind of goes with a certain ethnic cleansing, which oftentimes is violent. I mean, Lincoln, of course, in his famous Lyceum address in 1838, commenting and worrying about not only mob violence, connected with slavery, but mob violence all over the country. I mean, he knew about the murder of Elijah Lovejoy in Southern Illinois, and then of a person of African descent out in St. Louis. But he didn't think that these were exceptions to what was going on, and he worried that the, vision of the framers, of the founders, was being undermined. And this was something that, Tocqueville was writing about too, and he recognized this idea of the will of the community and the community taking law into its own hands and disciplining people based on its own particular views of who should belong and who wouldn't belong. And along with slavery, which he did think was a potential doom for the Republic, I think he recognized that American democracy was kind of tainted in a lot of important ways. So, I mean, so I think in a sense, what you end up was with a certain kind of illiberal democracy, a democracy that is built as much upon exclusions as it is upon inclusions. And, it's not enough simply to say, well, okay, it's a democracy of, white adult men. Well, yeah, it is, but it's also a democracy that is being founded on not simply the exclusion of other people, but the expulsion. I mean, think about the American Colonization Society and the whole logic of anti-slavery built on not only concerns about the morality and political wisdom of enslavement, but the impossibility of free Black people really residing within the United States. And, what's the solution? You expel them. I got really interested in this. I've been involved in prison education for the last 7 or 8 years, and it has forced me to actually, I felt like, well, I ought to learn a little bit more about, the history of incarceration. I teach a course on it now. And one of the things that's so striking is that, some of the strongest advocates and architects of the penitentiary were leaders in the anti-slavery movement. And, then you think, well, why, how is that? And, there is a logic to it, but it's kind of an expulsion as well. The idea is that people who misbehave, people who commit crimes, they should not be within the community. They feed off the bad, um, sort of the bad, sort of cultural aspects, and then they contaminate the communities too. Instead of punishing them within the communities around corporal punishment or humiliation, you need to remove them. Now, it's usually talked about removal just as, what happened to Native people isn't as the language is removal, but it's also expulsion. It's not entirely clear what you have to do to get back. And so I think there's a whole, and obviously the penitentiary is the 1820s, 1830s, some of the first ones are being constructed, and it catches on enormously. And it's really liberal types who are most enthusiastic about it. So what I try to suggest is that, there are these kind of not simply parallel developments, but increasingly entangled developments where even for a lot of social reformers of liberal disposition, they end up falling back on when it comes to maintaining order. They oftentimes fall back on what you might see as illiberal methods, because in the final analysis, they are interested in maintaining order. And they're not very optimistic about how certain social groups can be adequately integrated, absorbed, embrace a sense of belonging that is comfortable to them. And so what happens? Well, you kick them out. Now, I mean, nativism in the 1840s and 50s kind of feeds off these ideas as, the Irish immigrants are now increasingly poor, rural, Catholic, Gaelic speakers, and so on and so forth. So I think it's a really important thing to understand that even the moments we celebrate as being part of American exceptionalism, you know, are not quite what we think they are. And they reveal political dispositions and political demands that, we'd rather not recognize, but are there and are really deep.
And there's no doubt that violence played a key role in all of this. I think one of the things about modern American uh, politics, we talk about it. Every day, somebody's being called upon to denounce the role that violence might play in American politics.
It's
And
like Lincoln. It's,
right.
it's to say, hey, wait a second.
Hmm.
Look at what we're doing. And, as even back in this period, elections, especially in cities, but not, first of all, there's a lot of patron-client politics that, in some ways, political democratization entrenches rather than undermines. And second of all, as you know, especially in cities, I mean, elections are free-for-alls. And we know that in state legislatures and in Congress, people are carrying weapons, they're challenging each other to duels, they're stabbing each other. And so, this isn't all incidental, and it doesn't mean that American democracy is a fake. It simply means that these are the components of how we engage in politics, and that what we're seeing at the moment in this kind of horror that violence can be seen as a way of taking and then maintaining power is something that is shockingly new. Now, obviously, a lot of this stuff requires an awareness of how politics operates at the state and local level. So,
Hmm.
Donald Trump may be in some ways unprecedented in national presidential politics. And, in some ways, it's hard to think of anybody who has achieved the presidency or even a very serious contender who is like Trump. But once you get to state politics or once you get to local politics, then you're dealing with an entire, think of Reconstruction.
Oh,
And
yeah.
that's oftentimes seen as the outlier.
Right.
But it's sort of more of an outlier in degree rather than kind.
And the truth is that, I mean, even now we're hearing a lot about, violence on election day, violence at the polls, people being confronted and whether or not they can actually vote. And of course, that was going on widespread in the 1830s. I mean, literally on election day, people's right to, you shouldn't be in this line, you can't
That's
vote.
right.
Yeah. Yeah.
In places where they have viva voce voting,
Hmm.
where your employer is watching or you're depositing, tickets that were handed out by political parties. I mean, this is
Hmm.
not exactly a secret ballot.
Right.
So, American democracy is sort of, very much in public, and it very much sort of is meant to reflect the hierarchies of power and influence. One of the things even political scientists don't recognize is that you needed to post bond to take political office, and the bonds were often very, very high, which meant that even for local office holders, you needed sureties to sign on. Now, ostensibly, this was for means of, protecting against corruption. But at the same time, it reflected an idea that, power was in many ways vertical, and that in order to find sureties who could stand for these bonds, it was part of a whole patron-client system that endures for a very long time, and in many ways, to the present. I mean, to some extent, the decline of partisanship and partisan identity. I mean, we talk about the incredible divide in American politics, but the truth is, most people, regard themselves as independents rather than as politically aligned. And the patron-client system works a lot better when most people are aligned with a political party rather than floating out there where it's not easy to find a patron. They don't want a patron, but I still think, within political parties, the legacy of patron-client politics remains important, and it certainly was even more important the further back we go.
Hmm. Um, I want to leap ahead now to about 100 years ago. We could talk about the progressive era,
Yeah.
and again, this narrative that we've constructed about the very word itself, right? Progress. It denotes that things were, for the first time, we're confronting the evils of industrialism. We are forming labor unions. There's the 8 hour
Hmm.
day. We're doing away with child labor. All these things are seen
Hmm.
again as part of the narrative as moving toward liberty, rights,
Hmm.
freedom, this sort
Hmm.
of thing. And then you bump into the 1920s, and
Yeah.
I want to read a quote, two things from your book on the chapter, and the chapter, by the way, is entitled "Fascist Pulses."
Yes.
You say it all came to fruition in the 1920s with prohibition, immigration restriction, the enormous expansion of the Ku Klux Klan, a new Protestant fundamentalism, and the campaign for 100% Americanism, forms of social engineering meant to fortify a nation of white Protestants and hobble those not fit to join. And at the end of that paragraph, you say it may well be that the threads composing the fabric of Italian and German fascism were in earliest evidence in the United States, unquote. That is a startling declaration.
Right.
100 years ago in this country, you are basically saying that we tend to think of American democracy bumps into fascism in the 1930s, and these two things are in conflict. You're saying that the
Yes.
roots for what happened in Europe began here.
Yeah. Well, one of the things I really try to do and what real influenced my thinking about a lot of this was a re-engagement with the progressive period. And part of the argument of the book is to see a connection between what happens during what we call progressivism, roughly 1900 to 1920, and what we see in the 1920s leaking into the 1930s. Progressivism is generally portrayed as involving the birth of what we would call modern liberalism, an attempt to work out, redefine the relationships between the state, between capital and labor. Think about the political world as consisting of interest groups rather than atomized individuals. Thinking much more clearly and directly about large scale institutions and whether they ought to be regulated. But, what kind of opened things up for me was eugenics. I never really thought very much about it, and the literature on progressivism sees it as kind of a sidebar. But what was really unexpected to me was the centrality of eugenic thinking and broadly social engineering to people regarded as progressives almost across the political spectrum.
And
The
explain what
ideas,
eugenics are for people who don't
well,
know.
eugenics is something that were sort of developed in the late 19th century. Francis Galton, a British relative of Charles Darwin, is seen as one of the important sort of advocates. But the idea was that it's possible to engage in scientific breeding of human populations. The term eugenics kind of was birthed out of this. And it caught on with a lot of progressives who were interested. In a previous book I wrote called A Nation Without Borders, which kind of covers the 1830s into the um, progressive period. I talk about progressivism as involving a series of reconstructions. And I don't really use reconstruction to talk about the period we generally talk about in Reconstruction. But, eugenics kind of fit in very well with an idea that the social order was coming apart at the seams. Politically and economically, the Gilded Age was a time of intense social and political conflict. And, a lot of things you were talking about, which have to do with attacks on consolidated wealth and power, appeals for new ideas about popular democracy, the organization of labor unions, and populist type movements, Farmers Alliance, and so on, preceded this. And in many ways, progressivism is a response to try to sort of recalibrate the social and political order. And as we know, yes, progressivism raised questions about corporations and corporate practices, but at the same time, most progressives kind of accepted the existence and important economic viability of corporations. Yes, they thought maybe the state ought to regulate them, but at the same time, this is when Jim Crow comes into being in the southern states, and versions of it are nationwide. Of course, the federal government supports it in Plessy versus Ferguson, Williams versus Mississippi, the Lochner case, which makes it almost impossible to pass hours legislation for organized labor, a sense of maybe labor organization that was company unions and imperialism. This is the U.S., Spanish, Filipino, Cuban War that takes place, the sense among leaders like Teddy Roosevelt that the United States needed to uplift backward peoples, most of whom were regarded as racially inferior, the idea that a national belligerence was a very good idea. And, by the time of World War One, the state was turning its, sights on political radicals, passing sedition legislation, rounding people up, deporting people. Eugene Debs ran for president in 1920 from a prison cell. And so, as you mentioned, one of the things that happens, the American Legion is founded in the immediate aftermath of World War One. It prides itself on being like the Italian black shirts. So there's an enormous amount of as turning its vengeance against those who are regarded as un-American, as challenges to the social order that they claim to value. Mussolini is seen as in kind of heroic ways from the bottom up and from the top down. It's not until his invasion of Ethiopia in 1935 that, things turn in a more negative direction against him. And in many ways, I mean, the only thing that really prevented the Klan from, trying to build a closer relationship was that he was Catholic. And the Klan was as powerfully anti-Catholic or anti-Semitic as it was black, but as a number of scholars like Linda Gordon have pointed out, I mean, in the 1920s, the Klan achieves an enormous amount of influence and power in many parts of the country, often in places you'd never expect. I mean, the largest Klan membership is to be found in Chicago. We know that there are Klan marches all over the country, including Washington, DC, and they become the enforcers of prohibition. They push very strongly for the new Immigration Act in 1924, which, after Chinese exclusion is really the first major time that the federal government involves itself, and it involves quotas, especially for people from Southern and Eastern Europe who are regarded as backward and potentially leaning toward political radicalism.
Hmm.
And so I guess what I was sort of saying is that what you could see, I mean, I understand, it may not be convincing to everybody, but what you could see is the first signs of a kind of corporatist mentality, one that's organized around the idea of hierarchies, of race and ethnicity, using the federal government or state governments to enforce social distinctions and carry out forms of social and political repression, and to cultivate an idea of 100% Americans, which means that, there are certain requirements if you want belonging, disfranchisement of voters, not only black voters in the South, but immigrant voters outside of the South. And so, we know the election of 1896 was the high point. I mean, it was part of the political world of the 19th century, and that voter turnout really begins to decline nationally fairly dramatically, which is not affected by the enfranchisement of women around the 19th Amendment. So, and then, historians would recognize that the 1920s is pretty reactionary all around. What I would say is that, you can't really understand what happens in the 20s without understanding what happens before, because in a way, the federal government is centrally involved. And one of the things that kind of distinguishes our political moment from the 1920s, where it bears some resemblance, I mean, I think if you're looking for any decade, is that, people in the Klan were not, they saw the government on their side. they controlled the government at the local level. They had a lot of influence at the national level. The government was doing basically everything they wanted. So it wasn't
Hmm.
this sense of, the federal government is betraying us or is leaving us behind or is undermining our privileges, which is kind of about, the sort of political narrative from the right at the moment, where in the 1920s, they had nothing to complain about.
And to be clear about eugenics, because I sort of want to make clear how odious this was, is that the idea was that people who were social undesirables, be they black people, be they people accused of crimes,
Feeble-minded, right.
feeble-minded, people who were not smart, immigrants, whoever these people were, would be forcibly sterilized, so they could
Yeah,
not
well,
reproduce.
Woodrow
Right?
Wilson, as governor of New Jersey, signed the sterilization bill. And,
Hmm.
this kind of eugenic disposition is, I mean, to this day in penitentiaries, I mean, it's still a live political issue. And we know that some inmates, women women in particular, have been sterilized. And, this notion about I mean, Margaret Sanger
Hmm.
was one of the leaders of this, and now she's been kind of replaced in the pantheon of Planned Parenthood, precisely because they saw how she understood birth control as a means of
Hmm.
carrying out a form of scientific breeding. And she
Hmm.
used the idea of feeble-mindedness, constantly. And if you look at I remember when I started reading the minutes from some of these international birth control conferences, it was a who's who of American intellectual political life who were sitting there. And,
Hmm.
it helped me reread Herbert Crowley's Promise of American Life and the idea of the new nationalism. As I'm not saying it was fascist. I'm simply saying that a lot of the things that turn up in fascist regimes, either in Italy, I mean, eugenics was a close connection between scientists in Nazi Germany and
Hmm.
in the United States and sharing
Hmm.
this material. The Nazis actually thought that the Jim Crow one-drop rule laws were too rigid, for their own purposes of carrying out repression of Jews and other undesirables in
Yeah.
Germany. So I think you're looking at a kind of political moment where 19th century political liberalism is in bad odor. It is regarded as incapable of managing a new modern society where you have different kind of political institutions and different forms of political conflict, and the need for a consolidated power from the top, the undermining of what had been popular political institutions. So, I think the kind of critique of liberal political life that we certainly see from the right today is not unlike the critique of liberal politics that not only came from people on the right, but actually came from people like Crowley, who had disdain for what he called Jeffersonian democracy, meaning,
Hmm.
popular participation in politics, which bred corruption. And his view was people who were in positions of political power should be trained experts. I mean, partisanship is a bad thing. Popular politics was a bad thing. And people needed to know what he would call the national purpose. Now, I mean, I don't know about you, but I've read a lot about fascist and right-wing regimes, and this is a language of national belonging that is not unlike what you hear there. So,
Hmm.
I'm only saying that there's stuff going on in the United States that is more closely aligned with what happens elsewhere, and also is important for us to understand in the 1930s, where briefly, Roosevelt takes power almost at the exact moment that Hitler takes power. And a lot of people like Walter Lippmann and other liberals were basically saying, owing to the extremes of the Depression, that he was going to need to take dictatorial power to establish some kind of stability. And it worked out for all sorts of reasons that that wasn't really necessary, that the Constitution and constitutional government, representative government was not being undermined. But, a lot of the early New Deal was basically written in the White House and was rubber stamped in Congress. I'm not objecting to it. And as you know, early on, like the National Industrial Recovery Act had a lot of corporatist, features. So I think the United States ends up in a different place, but it's not as in the past because our liberal tradition was so strong. It's because of a lot of things that were happening in the 1930s, including
Hmm.
the mobilization of labor, the mobilization of people in the countryside, a left wing in the New Deal that managed to gain power rather than lose it over the course of the 1930s, and the ability to govern without challenging, constitutional norms and institutions. But there's a lot of stuff. If you read this, what people are worried about is not communism, it's fascism
Yeah.
and a lurch to the right. And the Ku Klux Klan may have disintegrated, but a lot of the people who were aligned with it, they're quite alive in politics, and they pop up, fairly quickly during the 1930s and into the World War II and the post-war period.
Well, you make it clear that, I mean, we all sort of heard about the Klan, and we know that it evolved out of the Reconstruction period to become anti-immigrant, anti-Catholic, anti-Jewish during the
Hmm.
20s. But one of the things you focus on is in the 1930s, there are groups like the American Protective League, and you mentioned the American Legion. These groups were out and out pro-fascist. They admired Hitler. They
Absolutely.
admired
Yep.
Mussolini. You mentioned a giant rally they had at Madison Square Garden with a gigantic banner behind them. I think of, remind me, was it Hitler or was it
No, it was
Mussolini?
of George Washington, who
Uh,
was regarded as
right.
the original fascist.
Yes. Yes.
I mean, it's really, I think until actually that was the largest political demonstration in Madison Square Garden until 1968, George
George
Wallace
Wallace. Yeah.
packed the place.
Hmm.
So, it's I think people need to know. I mean, Rachel Maddow has done some interesting stuff on the, 1940s and about fascism in a lot of areas of American life. I just think it, in some ways, it's not so much about who people who were explicitly aligned with fascists,
Hmm.
whether, Mussolini or eventually Hitler, because, to that extent, you're dealing with a distinct minority of people in political life. But if you want to think about people who found a lot of fascist ideas appealing,
Hmm.
I mean, think about Charles Lindbergh, right? And
Right.
the political influence and charisma that he had, and about the ideas of belonging that fascism represented, and the suspicions of internal as well as external enemies. And then I think you have a better idea of why it was that you see the emergence of the far right in the, 50s and early 60s, and you see, the amazing appeal that George Wallace had in 68, I mean 72, when he was basically sidelined by an assassination attempt. He had already won some Democratic primaries and done very well elsewhere. The story for him is, how is this guy who was a pariah on a national stage after that inaugural address in Mississippi, within months, is drawing big crowds in the North and ends up entering the 1964 primaries and winning a third of the vote in Wisconsin.
Hmm.
Then you got to think, well, wait a second. what are we dealing with here? And so this is in the 1960s when it seems that modern liberalism has basically cleared the political stage of all its opponents. And you realize that, Barry Goldwater might have gotten thumped, but that's the beginning.
Yeah.
Not the, Hofstadter pronounced the epitaph of conservatism
Hmm.
after the 64 election, but in retrospect, it's the birth
Yeah.
of modern conservatism and the, sign of a political right that was taking control.
And you probably I was looking because I've got the series of books written by Rick Perlman, who sort of followed
Yes,
he just wrote a whole book
absolutely.
about Goldwater and the 64
No,
election
I
as
mean
being the
his
beginning.
work I think has been very important in
Yeah.
terms of forcing us to recognize political currents that
Yeah.
oftentimes have been marginalized or dismissed.
Now, a lot of people would say, a lot of historians would say, okay, 1964, the reason Wallace did so well in Wisconsin is it's a conservative reaction to the events, let's say, beginning with Brown versus Board, going up through 64. It's about race. That all of the things we're talking about can, in some ways, be put down as a reaction to whenever there is a movement by a group of people in American history to say, we are part of the American dream too. We claim the rights that are laid forth in the Declaration and in the Bill of Rights. There's always going to be that group, and they're usually white, they're usually conservative, they're usually Protestants who say you're not included and you never were meant
Mhm,
to be included.
mhm.
Is what you're doing though is drawing a through line that there's more to it than just the occasional flash of anger that comes up from disgruntled white people. That the whole book is about this more. This is all more grounded in our traditions than we want to admit.
Well, that's right. I would say that. I'm not saying that it is an unchanging set of political ideas. I mean, tradition is, something that can be invented in a lot of different ways. And part of what I do try, to point out in the book is that, that's why the chapter that deals with progressivism is called Modernizing Illiberalism. I think Wallace, who has been underestimated as an antecedent of Trump,
Mm-hmm.
managed to, develop a new political vocabulary that I mean, it was about race, obviously, and it was about the attempt on the part of people of African descent to gain rights and to gain power and to gain standing in American society. And, Wallace talked about, overreach and state rights. I mean, here was a guy who was building his own authoritarian regime in Alabama, who somehow or other was talking about people's freedoms being, potentially in jeopardy. And
Mm-hmm.
so, I think he also fed off, a decade and a half of anti-communism that was a
Mm-hmm.
bipartisan project so
Mm-hmm.
that it was easy to associate struggles for power on the part of people who did not have a clear belonging to anti-colonial movements abroad, socialist movements abroad, communist movements abroad, so that, instead of looking at the world as, sort of broken up into all sorts of different political tendencies, it was a lot easier to see it as a kind of binary between, freedom and capitalism in the United States and socialism and repression everywhere else. And the communists were supporting people, black people and other people of color all over the world. And so it all seemed to come together. But I do think that these sort of deeper traditions of community defense, are really, really important because housing became a central issue in the 1950s and early 1960s because of the aftermath of World War II, the acceleration of Black migration outside of the South because of wartime mobilizations and enlistments and the federal government effectively sponsoring the development of both the South and the West, which is really important there. But then the boundaries of communities were challenged. Those who could afford it headed to the suburbs, where they were going to be protected in a variety of ways. But those who were, left behind in cities were, going to, seeing themselves as sort of saying, you can't come here. And I think Wallace, like Trump, had a certain kind of political genius for recognizing, what people could, were fearful of, and being able to work with that. And we don't know what would have happened had he, managed to survive politically on a national level in 1972. But, if you go back to 1968, there were a lot of people who thought that the election was going to go into the House of Representatives because Wallace, who was polling at about 20%, was going to prevent anyone from winning a majority of electoral votes. And if he didn't win, he was going to become the kingmaker. And certainly Nixon's law and order campaign, or his, silent majority ideas were, clearly influenced by the kind of campaign that Wallace was running, and the importance of the John Birch Society and the Klan and the Citizens Council and other right-wing organizations stretching across the Sun Belt out to Southern California, um, were saw him as the way forward.
Um, as we begin to wrap this up, I want to bring this up to the present only in the sense of saying, I know I get asked this as a historian, and I know you do, which is, so when Donald Trump finally, and I'm putting quotes on this, goes away, either he decides he doesn't want to run anymore, whatever happens in this election. If he is
Right.
elected, if he is elected, he will not be eligible by the Constitution to run
Well,
again.
right, but not clear he'll go away,
Exactly. Or
except
he
in a
just
coffin,
yeah, or if he gets
when
beat and decides he doesn't want to run again, the point is, will the movement, will Trumpism go away? And people want to find, I think, some sort of sense that that will be true. Your book seems to suggest it may go underground, the idea, but
yeah,
this will rise
I,
again,
I
right?
think, the response to Trump, at the beginning was this idea of, whoa, here is this really noxious character who's violating all our norms, and somehow or other, if he's defeated, which the hope was in 2016, I mean, I wrote a piece with Larry Powell in the summer of 2015, which was called The Face of Fascism. It was on Trump. No one would publish it. I mean, it's the first of many op-eds I haven't had published, but but I've sent it around. We didn't try to get it published online, so that was probably a mistake. But it basically said, and no one wanted to deal with it, and they didn't think he was going to win anyway. Um, I think it's important for us to recognize. I mean, I don't think there's any question that if Trump loses and he really is prevented from taking power, which I'm not entirely clear will be the case. But let's suppose for the moment that the result of the election is that Kamala Harris wins, and somehow or other, the election is certified. Okay, he's defeated. I think the Republicans, I think people like Nikki Haley and Ron, I mean, part of them are hoping that he loses because they know that their future will be blocked if he wins, because he's not going to leave office and he's going to taint them further. So there's no question that I think if Trump loses and he's basically increasingly marginalized in American politics, I mean, that will be significant. I don't think there's any question about it. But and I do think that the MAGA movement per se, its strength lies in certain sections demographically and economically of the population that is probably not a great foundation on which to build. Nonetheless, I think we would make a serious mistake if we could then breathe a so-called sigh of relief and go back to the political norms that we think we had, as if nothing else happened. I really, I think the future, you and I as historians, I keep saying to people who say, well, what are we going to do about this? And I would say, look, I'm a historian. I have a hard enough time figuring out what happened in the past, let alone what I think is going to happen The
In the
future,
future.
the only thing we can do as historians say, look, this came to be because of because we think of the
Hmm.
confluence of events, and therefore the question is, is the defeat of Trump, how much has that changed? And we are dealing in a world that is very explosive, where the crises on a global scale are so significant that a lot of the things that have brought this together, which is huge disruptions in people's lives, huge migrations that are taking place, not simply because they're fleeing political repression, but because, certain parts of the planet are becoming increasingly uninhabitable. That the kind of things that mobilize people's anxiety and in some cases hatred, they're not going away. Even if Kamala Harris manages to be in a position to actually enact, some of her programs. And even if things in the short term, turn in a positive direction for more and more Americans, a lot of these so-called existential crises, look at the Middle East, I mean, the end of the Cold War, I mean, I know have to wrap this up. I think we've underestimated the way in which the end of the Cold War has been a source of enormous disorder. Whatever you
Hmm.
think about the
Hmm.
challenges and dangers that the Cold War represented, we tend to focus on 9/11. But I think the Cold War ended the world that the French Revolution made, and we haven't really come to terms with what that means in terms of political choices, political ideas, ways of holding and wielding power, um, and the instabilities that came as a result. And I'm not sure we're any closer to confronting them now.
Well, as a historian, I always tell to your point about we don't predict the future, but I always say,
Except for Alan Lichtman.
except for Alan Lichtman, right? Yeah, who has a good time doing that. But I always say, remember that there were at least half the population, if not more, who did not want to see slavery come to an end. There were a lot of people who did not think fascism should fail, and at least half the population didn't want the civil rights movement to succeed. So we don't know what the future is, but the idea that somehow all of this is just going to go away and we're all going to become
Right.
friends again, I think is a little bit naive. And your book, I think, reinforces that there is a long tradition of no better word for it, illiberalism in
Right.
this country. Yeah.
But
Um,
I'll also say is that I think by recognizing illiberalism as a powerful current in American history and political life, that we also can recognize other things that are out there that can be recovered and that have opened up possibilities that we should value. I kind of end the book with an example of something that happened in Grimes County, Texas in the late 19th century, but as a way of seeing how alliances across what were thought to be untraversable lines can be forged,
mm,
and how ideas about democracy can develop. So they
mhm,
are there, but we
mhm.
have to understand that what we're up against.
Yeah. And one could argue that after reading your book, this is that in some ways this is so depressing and so scary. It's sort of like you wonder how America got this reputation
Yeah.
that it has. And you say at the end, history is a burden and an inspiration,
Yes.
which is powerful and something for all of us to think over. Well, the book is terrific. It's called Illiberal America, a history, and it really does, I think, give us a different way of looking at the past and at the future. Steve Hahn, thank you so much for coming on and
Thank
talking
you so
about
much
this.
for having me on. I really, really appreciate it. It's a great conversation.
Thank you. My thanks to Steven Hahn for joining me on this podcast. You can find out more about his book, Illiberal America, at www.norton.com. The hardest working producer and engineer in show business, the producer of this podcast, the czar of our Tallahassee office, as well as the captain of the GHS Dutch reverse racing team, is our very own and indispensable Brendan Cannonball Krellin. All guest accommodations on Off the Beaten Path provided by the Horseshoe Road Inn. Our Off the Beaten Path fact checker is Ella Fino. The GHS Director of Accounts Payable is Bill Schroeder. The Off the Beaten Path stock market predictor is Luigi Board. The GHS table saw operator is Les Digits. Our Director of Employee Loyalty is Upton Leftis. Our Staff Layoff Specialist is Harry Verderci, assisted by Layoff Counselor Oscar Lavista. Our Insurance Claims Liaison is Royal Payne Diaz. Our Customer Care Specialist is Begonia Payne Diaz. Our Complaints Coordinator is Stella Payne Diaz. Our IRS Liaison is Major Payne Diaz. And our Gastroenterologist is Cameron Diaz. Cameron. Our in-house literary critic is Al Ligori. The official Off the Beaten Path holiday decoration specialist is Aretha Holly. The GHS holiday wardrobe consultant is Don Wienow. Our staff director of Three Stooges Studies is Lee Iapocca. Dr. Todd Gross's personal eBay specialist is Selma Junkoff. And our Off the Beaten Path martini mixer, thank you very much, is Olive Twist. You can find our podcast anywhere you can find podcasts, including now on YouTube and YouTube Music. Be sure to follow and like and share, please. You can find out everything about the Georgia Historical Society at georgiahistory.com and the Georgia History Festival at georgiahistoryfestival.org. Be sure and like Off the Beaten Path on Facebook as well. Please also visit deatonpath.georgiahistory.com and check out dispatches from Off the Beaten Path, my blog, and similar Storming the Ramparts podcasts like this one. Stay safe, stay strong. I'm Stan Deaton with the Georgia Historical Society. As always, thank you for listening.